Hello, welcome to my presentation. My name is Bayan Saeed, and today I will be discussing intersectional feminism and media portrayals of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in U.S. cities. Missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is a current epidemic and crisis affecting Indigenous communities in the United States. Indigenous women are being taken or murdered at unrelenting rates. According to the National Crime Information Center, in 2016 alone, there were 5,172 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Out of those cases, only 116 were logged into the Department of Justice Missing Peoples database. Indigenous women are 2.5 times more likely to be raped or sexually assaulted than non Indigenous women. Missing murdered Indigenous women and girls is a current crisis that is not receiving enough national attention. Indigenous women are the most victimized group, and institutionalized racism continues to silence this crisis. These women experience high rates of violence, which is a violation of their human rights. There is little to zero media reportings of Indigenous women who are missing and murdered, so not many people are aware of this crisis. Continuous systematic oppression and discrimination from the state, law enforcement, and media continue to ignore this crisis. It should be our priority to ensure the safety of Indigenous women, and everyone has a role to play in protecting and giving justice to Indigenous women and their families. The Urban Indian Health Institute is a community health center that conducts research and evaluations in Indigenous peoples' communities. In their 2018 report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, they looked at 506 cases of missing or murdered urban Indian women and girls in 71 cities across 29 states dating back to 1943. The Urban Indian Health Institute also conducted a content analysis to assess why gathering data on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is difficult, how law enforcement is responding to these cases, and how the media is reporting cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Of the 506 cases included in the study, 128 are missing person cases, 280 are murder cases, and 98 have an unknown status. The median age of women at the center of these cases is 29 years of age. The Urban Indian Health Institute collected data from the Freedom of Information Act, which grants individuals the right to access federal agency records and state national databases. They also collected data from media coverage, social media, and family and community members of loved ones. The Urban Indian Health Institute collected data from 71 cities across 29 states, as shown in the map. These cities were chosen to collect data who have an urban Indian health center, a population of urban Indians, or have a large number of missing murdered Indigenous women and girls cases. The regions with the highest number of cases are the Southwest, Northern Plains, Pacific Northwest, Alaska, and California. I will use Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality to understand overlapping or intersecting social identities that relate to system and structures of oppression, domination, or discrimination. Indigenous women experience stigmatization and oppression as a result of both their race and gender, also other sociocultural factors. Using an intersectional feminist perspective is necessary to address the systematic inequalities Indigenous women face. The conceptual tools I will be applying to the report are Collins' Outsider Within and Controlling Images from her book Black Feminist Thought. I will also be using Henry Guru's Politics of Disposability. The Urban Indian Health Institute gathered content analysis of media coverage of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. What they found was majority of cases in urban areas were not discussed in the media. What they also found was 36 media outlets used violent language when covering cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, such as reference to drug and alcohol use, misgendering transgender victims, referencing the victim's criminal history, referencing sex work, giving wrong information of the case or not sharing the victim's name, making excuses for the perpetrator or victim blaming, and showing the images of the victim's death. To make sense of the media statistics provided by the Urban Indian Health Institute report, I will be using the conceptual tools to argue how the media uses controlling images to justify maltreatment. The lack of media reporting renders missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls as invisible. Indigenous women's well being and experiences are disregarded in U.S. society. Collins uses the outsider within concept to identify social locations marking the boundaries between groups of unequal power. Individuals acquire identities by their placement in these social locations, such as race, gender, class, sexuality, and other social factors. When looking at the media coverage on missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls, it reflects the outsider position Indigenous women are placed in. Marginalization and oppression force Indigenous women into the position of the outsider within. Native people historically are a marginalized position geographically and socially. Insufficient media reporting renders their experiences as invisible. In the report, the Urban Indian Health Institute mentioned that the majority of media coverage on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls focused on reservation based violence and completely diminished cases in urban areas. Indigenous people are viewed within the colonial mindset that they live only on reservations, reinforcing the idea that they are not part of the broader society. Media coverage focusing on reservation based violence overlooks and ignores the experiences of urban Native women and further illustrates marginal status that they occupy. Those who wield power are enabling systematic oppression and discrimination towards Indigenous women. The Urban Indian Health Institute uses the outsider within lens to critique and challenge structural oppression and violence of the larger society. Collin argues being an outsider within allows you to see and critique the problems within society and encourages resilience. Community groups such as the Urban Indian Health Institute is extremely needed because mainstream health and political organizations do not adequately address issues that Native people face. Collins' concept of controlling images reflects images that are designed to make racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression seem natural and normal. In the Urban Indian Health Institute report, their findings on the controlling images used when covering missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls reference negative stereotypes such as drug and alcohol use and addiction, sex work, and discussed past criminal records. These repetitive controlling images that Indigenous women are referenced to normalizes the violence against them and frames Indigenous women as less worthy of our media attention. These stereotypical images frame this issue as an individual problem rather than a social problem that it is. These controlling images make injustices against Indigenous women and girls seem natural and uses victim blaming, which allows those in power to ignore the structural inequalities that make them more susceptible to violence. Henry Grew refers to politics of disposability to describe how disadvantaged communities are perceived to be useless and thus expendable. The Urban Indian Health Institute statistics of violent language further justified Indigenous women as disposables. 8% of news coverage gave wrong information about the case and did not share the victim's name. 4% of cases covered made excuses for the perpetrator or used victim blaming. By misrepresenting Indigenous women in the media, these are acts of erasure and disposability of Indigenous women's well being and experiences. Missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls is a national crisis that is affecting Indigenous communities in the United States. The Urban Indian Health Institute media coverage on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls highlights how Indigenous women are misrepresented and underrepresented in the media, by the lack of media coverage, the use of controlling images, and disregarding their well being and experiences. The media plays a crucial role in reporting violence against Indigenous women and girls and needs to address this epidemic in a manner that is respectful to the victims and their communities. Indigenous women and girls deserve to live a life freely and safely from violence. Thank you.